Quiet Mind Stories. Tonight we explore why you wake up at 3 a.m. and struggle to fall back asleep, and what your brain is doing during those early morning hours. Waking up in the middle of the night can feel confusing. The room is dark. Everything is quiet. Your body was asleep just moments ago. And then, suddenly, you are awake. Not fully alert, but conscious enough to notice the silence. You may look at the clock. 3:07, 3:18, 3:42. The time feels specific, almost patterned. You might wonder why it happens so often around this hour. Why not midnight? Why not sunrise? Why this narrow window in the early morning? This experience is more common than it seems, and it is rarely random. Sleep moves in cycles. Throughout the night, your brain shifts between stages: light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep. Each cycle lasts roughly 90 minutes. By the time 3 a.m. arrives, you are often transitioning between stages. Transitions are fragile moments. They are points where the brain briefly rises closer to wakefulness before descending again. Most of the time you do not notice these transitions, but if something increases alertness slightly, even briefly, you become aware. That slight increase can come from many sources: a subtle stress response, a small shift in blood sugar, a dream with emotional tone, a noise too faint to remember, or simply internal monitoring activating at the wrong moment. There is also a hormonal shift happening in the early morning hours. Cortisol, the hormone associated with alertness, begins rising several hours before you wake. This is called the cortisol awakening response. It prepares your body for morning. But if cortisol rises slightly earlier than needed, it can nudge you into consciousness. Not fully awake, but aware enough to notice that you are awake. At this hour, the world is silent. There are no distractions, no movement, no light. In that silence, internal awareness feels amplified. A single thought can feel loud. A small concern can feel significant. And once awareness locks onto thought, returning to sleep becomes more difficult. Waking at 3 a.m. is not usually a sign of something broken. It is often the result of normal sleep architecture interacting with subtle physiological changes. But the moment you notice you are awake, something else begins. Monitoring. You may check the time again, calculate how many hours remain, estimate tomorrow's fatigue. That calculation activates cognition. Cognition increases alertness. Alertness delays the next descent into sleep. The wakefulness that might have lasted only seconds now stretches into minutes, then longer. The more attention you give the wakefulness, the more stable it becomes. Sleep requires reduced monitoring, but at 3 a.m. monitoring often increases, and that shift is what makes falling back asleep harder than falling asleep initially. The early morning hours carry a unique biological signature. Around 3 a.m., your body temperature is near its lowest point. Core body temperature naturally drops during the night to support sleep, but as it reaches its lowest point, the system begins preparing to rise again. That gradual rise signals the approach of morning. This subtle physiological shift can increase light alertness. Not enough to fully wake most people, but enough to make transitions between sleep stages more noticeable. Sleep is not a single, continuous state. It is layered. You move from light sleep into deeper stages, then into REM sleep where dreaming becomes more vivid. REM sleep often increases in duration during the second half of the night. By 3 a.m., you may be entering or exiting REM. REM sleep is emotionally active. The brain processes memories, integrates experiences, and rehearses social and emotional material. If a dream carries emotional intensity, it can elevate heart rate slightly. Breathing may shift. Muscle tone may fluctuate. These subtle changes can push awareness closer to the surface. When awareness surfaces during a quiet hour, it feels dramatic because the silence amplifies it. You may wake with no clear memory of a dream, but your nervous system may still carry the emotional residue of it. That residue can create a sense of alertness without obvious cause. Another factor is blood sugar regulation. During the night, your body continues using glucose for brain activity. If blood sugar dips slightly, the body may release small amounts of cortisol or adrenaline to stabilize it. These hormones increase alertness. Again, not dramatically, but enough to bring you into partial wakefulness. Most of the time, these adjustments happen without your awareness. You turn slightly, shift position, return to sleep within seconds. But if mental monitoring activates at the same moment, the wakefulness stabilizes. Monitoring is often triggered by one simple thought. What time is it? That question pulls you into cognition. Cognition strengthens wakefulness. Wakefulness makes returning to sleep harder. There is also a psychological element. 3 a.m. is culturally associated with wakefulness and worry. If you have previously struggled at this hour, your brain may anticipate difficulty. Anticipation increases alertness. Alertness confirms the anticipation. The pattern strengthens. Over time, 3 a.m. becomes associated with vigilance rather than rest. The association itself increases the likelihood of waking fully. The brain learns quickly. If you frequently check the clock at this hour, the time becomes meaningful. Meaning strengthens attention. Attention sustains awareness. Awareness delays descent back into sleep. Waking at 3 a.m. is rarely about a single cause. It is often the intersection of biological rhythm, hormonal shifts, sleep stage transitions, and mental monitoring. When these align, awareness rises. Whether it settles again quickly depends largely on what happens next. There is also something important about how the brain behaves during partial awakenings. When you wake briefly at 3 a.m., you are not fully in daytime consciousness. You are in a transitional state. Part of the brain is awake. Part of it is still operating in sleep mode. This mixed state makes thinking feel different, less grounded, more emotionally weighted. The rational filtering that normally moderates concern is weaker. At this hour, a simple thought can feel unusually significant. You might remember something you said earlier in the week, or think about something happening tomorrow. In daylight, these thoughts would pass quickly, but at 3 a.m. they linger, because the cognitive systems that normally down-regulate emotion are not fully online. The amygdala, which processes emotional relevance, remains sensitive during night awakenings. If a thought carries even slight emotional charge, the amygdala can increase alertness. That alertness shifts your nervous system closer to wakefulness. You may feel your heart beating more clearly, or notice a slight change in breathing. These sensations are subtle, but once noticed, they reinforce awareness. Awareness stabilizes wakefulness. There is also the phenomenon of cognitive isolation. At 3 a.m., there is no contextual grounding, no sunlight, no ambient activity, no evidence of normal daily life. Without environmental context, thoughts lose proportion. A small worry can feel large because there is nothing external to balance it. The world feels paused. When the world feels paused, internal experience feels magnified. This magnification can give the impression that something is wrong, but often nothing is wrong. The brain is simply more sensitive in this transitional state. You may also experience a sense of loneliness at this hour. Even if you are not alone, the silence can feel expansive, and expansiveness increases internal focus. Internal focus increases the likelihood of rumination. Rumination keeps cognitive networks active. Active networks prevent the descent back into deeper sleep. Another subtle factor is expectation memory. If you have previously woken at this hour and struggled, the brain remembers. Memory shapes physiology. When you wake and see 3 a.m., the memory of past difficulty may activate. That activation increases alertness. Alertness confirms expectation. Expectation strengthens pattern. The more often this cycle repeats, the more automatic it becomes. But automatic does not mean permanent. Patterns weaken when attention changes. The wake-up itself is normal. It is what happens after awareness that determines whether you drift back easily or remain awake longer. Another key element in 3 a.m. awakenings is how the brain interprets silence. Silence at this hour is different from silence earlier in the night. It feels deeper, more absolute, and in deep silence, internal awareness becomes dominant. During the day, your brain filters constantly. It decides which signals matter, which thoughts deserve attention, which sensations can be ignored. At 3 a.m., filtering is reduced. The brain is still partially in sleep mode. This means emotional and sensory signals may feel more pronounced. You might suddenly become aware of your breathing, or your heartbeat, or a faint sound in the distance. These signals are neutral, but attention can turn them into significance. Once attention locks onto a signal, alertness increases. Alertness reinforces wakefulness. There is also the effect of light sensitivity. Even small amounts of light at this hour can interrupt melatonin flow. If you check your phone or turn on a screen, the brain interprets that light as a cue. Light signals daytime. Daytime signals alertness. Even brief exposure can delay the return to sleep. You may not feel fully awake, but the biological signal has shifted. Another factor is temperature regulation. Your body temperature begins rising gradually toward morning. This rise prepares you for waking. If the rise happens slightly earlier than expected, you may wake sooner. The change can feel subtle, just enough to bring awareness to the surface. Combined with cognitive monitoring, that awareness becomes stable. There is also a psychological phenomenon known as nocturnal rumination. Rumination at night feels different from rumination during the day. It is quieter, more internal, more abstract. Without environmental cues, thoughts may become more philosophical. You might question direction, meaning, future outcomes. These thoughts can feel heavier in darkness. Darkness reduces sensory grounding. Reduced grounding increases abstraction. Abstraction increases emotional tone. Emotional tone sustains wakefulness. At 3 a.m., the mind is especially susceptible to abstract thinking because it is transitioning between REM cycles. REM is associated with emotional integration and memory processing. If a memory surfaces during this time, it may carry emotional charge. That charge can be enough to prevent immediate return to sleep. Again, nothing dramatic is required, just slight activation. And slight activation is enough in this fragile window. The wake-up is not the problem. The interpretation of the wake-up is often what extends it. There is also something subtle about the way the mind reacts to interrupted sleep. When sleep is broken, even briefly, the brain becomes sensitive to threat detection. This does not mean danger is present. It means the system shifts into assessment mode. Assessment mode asks a simple question. Why am I awake? The moment that question forms, cognition activates. Cognition increases alertness. Alertness stabilizes wakefulness. At 3 a.m., assessment mode can be especially strong because the environment feels unfamiliar. The darkness feels deeper. The silence feels absolute. The absence of activity can make small sensations feel exaggerated. A distant sound, a shift in breathing, a memory fragment, all can feel more noticeable than they would earlier in the night. Another important factor is expectation bias. If you have ever struggled at this hour before, your brain remembers. The moment you wake and see 3 a.m., a prediction may form. This is going to be hard. That prediction is subtle, but it changes physiology. Muscle tone may increase slightly. Breathing may become more deliberate. Heart rate may rise just enough to sustain awareness. Expectation influences biology more than we often realize. The brain prepares for what it anticipates. If it anticipates difficulty, it increases monitoring. Monitoring delays sleep. There is also a phenomenon known as micro-stress amplification. Small worries that would feel insignificant during the day can feel amplified in the early morning hours. This is partly due to reduced cognitive buffering. When tired, your brain has less capacity to contextualize concerns. Without context, concerns feel larger. Larger concerns feel urgent. Urgency keeps the system alert. You may notice that thoughts at 3 a.m. feel more absolute, more final, more dramatic, but often, by morning, those same thoughts feel manageable again. This shift reveals something important. The thoughts themselves were not the problem. The timing and state of the brain were. During partial wakefulness, emotional centers have more influence than rational centers. This imbalance creates intensity. Intensity sustains wakefulness. As long as intensity remains, the brain hesitates to descend back into deeper sleep stages. And so the moment stretches, not because something is wrong, but because the system is sensitive in this transitional window. When you wake at 3 a.m., you are often coming out of REM sleep. REM sleep is the stage most connected to emotional processing and memory integration. During this phase, the brain is highly active, even though the body remains still. It is sorting recent experiences, linking them to older memories, reprocessing emotional material in a quieter form. If you wake during or immediately after AIM, your emotional system may still be partially activated. Even if you do not remember dreaming, this creates a transitional neurological state. Part of your brain is conscious. Part of it is still operating within dream networks. In this mixed condition, thinking feels different from daytime thinking. It feels less grounded, more emotionally weighted, more sensitive to meaning. A small concern may carry unexpected intensity. A neutral memory may suddenly feel important. This happens because the prefrontal cortex is not fully engaged yet. The prefrontal cortex normally helps regulate emotional reactions and provide proportion. When its activity is reduced, emotional signals feel stronger and less filtered. At 3 a.m., the brain is also highly sensitive to perceived relevance. If a thought appears that seems even slightly important, the nervous system may respond with increased alertness. The increase does not need to be dramatic. A faint rise in heart rate, a subtle tightening in the jaw, a small change in breathing rhythm. These minor physiological shifts are enough to stabilize awareness at the surface. You may also notice that time feels distorted. Minutes stretch longer than they actually are. The silence feels deeper and more expansive. Without daylight, movement, or background sound, there are no external anchors. When external anchors disappear, internal experience feels amplified. A single thought can feel larger simply because nothing competes with it. There is also a natural impulse to explain unexpected awakenings. The mind may begin scanning quietly for a reason. Was it a dream? A sound? A physical sensation? That scanning activates analytical circuits in the brain. Once activated, analytical circuits do not disengage immediately. They look for patterns. They look for meaning. If you then check the clock, calculation begins. How many hours remain? How tomorrow might be affected? Whether enough sleep has already happened. Calculation strengthens cognitive engagement. Cognitive engagement increases alertness. Alertness delays the brain's return to deeper sleep stages. The awakening itself is usually brief and biologically ordinary. What extends it is the sustained mental engagement that follows. When attention locks onto wakefulness, wakefulness becomes more stable, and stability makes drifting back into sleep more difficult. Another important factor in 3 a.m. awakenings is the role of cortisol. Cortisol is often described as a stress hormone, but it also plays a key role in regulating wakefulness. In a healthy sleep cycle, cortisol begins rising gradually several hours before your natural waking time. This rise prepares the body for morning. It increases alertness, supports energy mobilization, and gently shifts the brain toward wakefulness. For many people, this rise begins somewhere between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. If the rise happens slightly earlier than expected, awareness may surface before you are ready to wake. The effect is usually subtle. You are not fully energized, but you are no longer deeply asleep. If stress levels have been elevated during the day, this cortisol rise can feel sharper. Even low-grade stress increases baseline activation in the nervous system. When cortisol rises on top of that baseline, wakefulness becomes more likely. You may not feel anxious, but you may feel alert enough to notice that you are awake. There is also an interaction between cortisol and blood sugar regulation. During the night, your body continues using glucose to support brain function. If blood sugar dips slightly, the body may release cortisol to stabilize it. This release can increase alertness briefly. In most cases, the brain transitions back into sleep within seconds. But if cognitive monitoring activates at the same time, wakefulness becomes sustained. You may notice a thought appearing quickly after waking. Not necessarily a dramatic one, just something mildly important. Cortisol makes the brain more sensitive to relevance. When relevance is detected, alertness strengthens. Alertness delays sleep. There is also a psychological layer tied to early morning awakenings. Morning represents responsibility, movement, expectation. Even if you are not fully awake, your brain understands that 3 a.m. is closer to morning than midnight. That awareness can create subtle pressure. Pressure increases monitoring. Monitoring increases alertness. This is why waking at 3 a.m. often feels different from waking earlier in the night. It carries the sense of approaching daylight, approaching activity, approaching obligation. Even if those obligations are still hours away, the body may still feel tired, but the internal signal has shifted slightly toward preparation, and that shift makes returning to sleep more fragile. Another reason 3 a.m. awakenings feel intense is because cognitive control is temporarily reduced during the second half of the night. By this hour, you have already cycled through several stages of sleep. Deep sleep has mostly occurred earlier in the night. Now the brain spends more time in lighter stages and REM. Lighter stages make awakenings easier. REM makes emotions more accessible. When you wake during this period, your emotional brain may be more active than your logical brain. This imbalance changes how thoughts are experienced. A simple memory may feel unusually meaningful. A small uncertainty may feel urgent, not because it truly is urgent, but because the emotional tone is amplified. At 3 a.m., there are no daytime signals to provide proportion. No sunlight, no movement outside, no evidence that the world is functioning normally. Without these cues, the brain lacks contextual reassurance. Context helps regulate emotional intensity. When context is missing, internal signals feel larger. You may also experience what feels like sudden clarity. Thoughts can appear sharp, almost hyper-focused. This happens because distractions are absent. There is no competing noise, no visual stimulation, no conversation. When external input drops, internal cognition becomes more dominant. Dominant cognition can feel urgent. Urgency increases alertness. Alertness delays sleep. There is also a phenomenon known as anticipatory stress. Even if you are not consciously worried, the brain may begin preparing for the upcoming day. Preparation can happen automatically. The mind may simulate conversations, rehearse responsibilities, review unfinished tasks. This simulation is subtle, but it activates executive networks. Executive networks are associated with wakefulness. When they activate, deeper sleep becomes harder to access. You may notice that once a single structured thought forms, others follow. Structure builds momentum. Momentum keeps the brain organized. Organized thinking is incompatible with sleep onset. Sleep requires thoughts to lose structure, to fragment, to soften. But if meaning remains attached, fragmentation does not occur easily. The wake-up itself may have lasted only seconds. What prolongs it is the chain reaction that follows. Attention leads to structure. Structure leads to alertness. Alertness prevents descent. The hour itself is not the cause. It is the state of the brain at that hour that makes return to sleep more delicate. When you wake at 3 a.m., one of the most powerful forces working against sleep is mental momentum. Mental momentum is the tendency for one structured thought to generate another. During the day, momentum is useful. It helps you plan, solve problems, make decisions. But at night, momentum keeps the brain organized, and organized thinking delays sleep. Sleep requires a gradual loss of structure. Thoughts need to fragment. They need to loosen. They need to drift without direction. But if a thought forms clearly, especially one connected to responsibility or meaning, the brain treats it as relevant. Relevance strengthens attention. Attention sustains alertness. At 3 a.m., relevance feels amplified because there is no competing stimulation. No noise, no light, no movement. When the external world is silent, the internal world feels louder. A single unfinished task may begin as a brief memory, but if you attach to it, it becomes a scenario. The scenario becomes analysis. Analysis becomes projection. Projection activates planning networks. Planning networks are wake-state networks. Once those networks activate, the brain shifts further from sleep. There is also something subtle about how the mind perceives vulnerability at this hour. You are lying still, in darkness, without movement. Biologically, darkness once meant uncertainty. Even though your environment is safe, ancient neural pathways still associate darkness with monitoring. If wakefulness happens during this monitoring window, the system may remain slightly elevated. Not anxious, just alert. Alert enough to prevent deep descent. You may also notice that your thoughts at 3 a.m. feel unusually convincing. They feel final, as if the conclusions you reach are absolute. This is partly because emotional centers are more active than logical moderation systems during partial wakefulness. Without full rational filtering, thoughts feel more true than they might in daylight. By morning, the same thoughts often lose intensity. This reveals something important. The content of the thought is rarely the true problem. The state of the brain is. When the brain is in a fragile transitional state, meaning attaches easily. Meaning sustains attention. Attention sustains wakefulness. The longer attention remains fixed, the harder it becomes for thought to fragment naturally. And without fragmentation, sleep does not resume easily. The wake-up itself is brief, but mental momentum is what turns seconds into minutes, and minutes into longer stretches of awareness. Another element that influences early morning awakenings is the brain's relationship with uncertainty. During the day, uncertainty can be managed through action. You can respond to messages, adjust plans, solve problems, move your body, interact with other people. But at 3 a.m., action is paused. The body is still. The room is quiet. There is nothing immediate to respond to. When action is unavailable, the mind sometimes tries to resolve uncertainty through thinking. This thinking often begins quietly. A small question appears. something unfinished, something unclear. The brain naturally tries to close open loops. Open loops create psychological tension. Closing loops usually requires action, but during the night, action is not possible. So the brain continues reviewing the loop instead. Review becomes rumination. Rumination keeps cognitive networks active. Active networks make the return to sleep more delicate. There is also a shift in perspective that happens during the early morning hours. When you wake during daylight, the world provides reassurance. You can see movement, hear activity, recognize that life is continuing normally. But at 3 a.m., the world feels paused. This pause can create a subtle sense of isolation. Even if nothing is wrong, the silence makes thoughts feel more personal, more significant, more urgent. Another reason thoughts feel heavier at this hour is fatigue. Fatigue lowers emotional resilience. When resilience lowers, concerns feel larger. A small uncertainty may feel important enough to examine. Examination activates analysis. Analysis strengthens alertness. Alertness delays sleep. You may also notice that thoughts at 3 a.m. often feel unusually convincing. They feel final, as if the conclusions you reach are completely accurate. But by morning, those same thoughts often lose intensity. This reveals something important. The content of the thought is rarely the main problem. The state of the brain is. During partial wakefulness, emotional interpretation is stronger than logical evaluation. When emotional interpretation dominates, thoughts feel more serious than they truly are. As long as that seriousness remains, the brain keeps attention engaged. And attention is what keeps wakefulness stable. Another reason returning to sleep feels difficult at 3 a.m. is the shift in cognitive priority. During the first half of the night, the brain prioritizes physical restoration. Deep sleep dominates. Energy is conserved. Repair processes are active. But in the second half of the night, emotional processing and memory integration become more prominent. This makes awakenings feel more mental than physical. You may feel physically tired, but mentally alert. This contrast can feel confusing. The body feels ready for rest. The mind feels ready for engagement. When engagement begins, even subtly, sleep becomes fragile. You might notice a quiet reviewing process, not intentional, just automatic. The brain revisits recent interactions, evaluates tone, replays conversations. At 3 a.m., these reviews can feel more intense than they would during the day. Without context, small social moments can feel magnified. This happens because social processing networks remain sensitive during AM transitions. If you wake during that sensitivity, reflection feels stronger. Another layer involves prediction. The brain is constantly predicting what comes next. As morning approaches, prediction systems begin preparing for activity. Preparation can feel like restlessness, not physical movement, but mental readiness. Readiness is incompatible with surrender. Surrender is required for sleep. You may also experience what feels like heightened clarity. Thoughts may feel sharp. well-formed, organized. This clarity is not a sign of increased productivity. It is a sign that executive networks have reactivated. Executive networks belong to wakefulness. When they come online, deeper sleep recedes. Even slight executive activation makes it harder to drift. The more you engage with a thought, the more structured it becomes. Structure sustains alertness. Alertness delays sleep, and so the moment extends. The awakening itself may have lasted only seconds, but engagement lengthens it. Once engagement softens, sleep becomes possible again. Another element that influences early morning awakenings is the brain's relationship with uncertainty. During the day, uncertainty can be managed through action. You can respond to messages, adjust plans, solve problems, move your body, interact with other people. But at 3 a.m., action is paused. The body is still. The room is quiet. There is nothing immediate to respond to. When action is unavailable, the mind sometimes tries to resolve uncertainty through thinking. This thinking often begins quietly. A small question appears, something unfinished, something unclear. The brain naturally tries to close open loops. Open loops create psychological tension. Closing loops usually requires action, but during the night, action is not possible. So the brain continues reviewing the loop instead. Review becomes rumination. Rumination keeps cognitive networks active. Active networks make the return to sleep more delicate. There is also a shift in perspective that happens during the early morning hours. When you wake during daylight, the world provides reassurance. You can see movement, hear activity, recognize that life is continuing normally. But at 3 a.m., the world feels paused. This pause can create a subtle sense of isolation. Even if nothing is wrong, the silence makes thoughts feel more personal, more significant, more urgent. Another reason thoughts feel heavier at this hour is fatigue. Fatigue lowers emotional resilience. When resilience lowers, concerns feel larger. A small uncertainty may feel important enough to examine. Examination activates analysis. Analysis strengthens alertness. Alertness delays sleep. You may also notice that thoughts at 3 a.m. often feel unusually convincing. They feel final, as if the conclusions you reach are completely accurate. But by morning, those same thoughts often lose intensity. This reveals something important. The content of the thought is rarely the main problem. The state of the brain is. During partial wakefulness, emotional interpretation is stronger than logical evaluation. When emotional interpretation dominates, thoughts feel more serious than they truly are. As long as that seriousness remains, the brain keeps attention engaged. And attention is what keeps wakefulness stable. Another reason early morning awakenings can feel difficult is the way attention behaves in silence. During the day, your attention is constantly pulled outward. You see movement, hear conversations, notice changes in light. Your brain automatically shifts focus between many signals. This constant movement of attention prevents any single thought from dominating for long. But at 3 a.m., the environment is almost completely still. There is no conversation, no daylight, no movement outside your room. Without these external signals, attention turns inward. When attention turns inward, internal experience becomes more noticeable. You may become aware of your breathing, or the rhythm of your heartbeat, or a thought that appeared quietly. Normally, these signals would pass unnoticed, but in silence they feel stronger. The brain interprets stronger signals as meaningful. Meaning strengthens attention. Attention stabilizes awareness. Another subtle factor is the absence of temporal structure. During the day, time is divided into events: meals, meetings, conversations, movement between places. These events create a rhythm that guides the mind forward. But at 3 a.m., time feels open and undefined. There are no immediate transitions ahead. Without structure, the mind sometimes fills the space with reflection. Reflection can easily turn into analysis. Analysis activates planning networks. Planning networks belong to wakefulness. The more planning networks activate, the more stable wakefulness becomes. You might notice that once a single structured thought appears, others begin to follow. One memory leads to another. One question leads to another. This is the beginning of mental momentum. Mental momentum keeps thoughts organized, and organized thinking delays sleep. Sleep requires thoughts to loosen their structure, to become less sequential, less meaningful, less connected. But if meaning remains attached to the thoughts that appear, the brain keeps working with them. As long as the brain is working with them, attention remains engaged. And as long as attention remains engaged, sleep remains just out of reach. Another subtle factor that influences early morning awakenings is the way the brain interprets stillness. During the day, stillness rarely lasts long. There are always signals around you: movement outside a window, the sound of people speaking, the quiet rhythm of daily activity. Your brain continuously processes these signals without effort. They provide orientation. They remind the mind that the world is functioning normally. But at 3 a.m., most of those signals disappear. The environment becomes unusually quiet. The stillness can feel deeper than silence during the day. In that stillness, internal awareness becomes more noticeable. You may become aware of your breathing, or the subtle rhythm of your heartbeat, or the faint presence of a thought that appeared quietly. Normally, these sensations pass through awareness without importance, but in a silent environment, they feel stronger. The brain naturally assigns more meaning to stronger signals. Meaning draws attention. Attention stabilizes awareness. Another reason the mind becomes more active at this hour is the absence of immediate tasks. During the day, your attention moves forward through actions. You respond to messages, move between locations, interact with other people. These actions guide attention outward. But at 3 a.m. there is nothing to respond to, nothing to complete, nothing to organize. Without action, attention sometimes turns inward. When attention turns inward, reflection becomes easier. Reflection is not harmful. It is a normal mental process. But reflection can slowly shift into analysis. Analysis activates planning networks in the brain. Planning networks belong to wakefulness. When those networks activate, the mind becomes more structured. Structure keeps thoughts connected. Connected thoughts maintain alertness, and alertness delays the brain's return to deeper sleep stages. The awakening itself may have lasted only a moment, but the attention that follows can quietly extend it. Another reason returning to sleep feels difficult at 3 a.m. is the way awareness behaves after an interruption. Sleep normally happens through gradual descent. Awareness fades slowly. Thoughts become less structured. The mind begins to drift without direction. But when you wake unexpectedly, that descent is interrupted. Awareness rises quickly. Once awareness rises, the brain becomes temporarily alert to its surroundings. You may not feel fully awake, but the brain begins observing. It notices the room, the quiet, the darkness, and the simple fact that you are awake. This observation can feel neutral at first, but observation easily turns into monitoring. Monitoring asks a quiet question. How long have I been awake? That question seems small, but it activates attention. Attention increases alertness. Alertness makes returning to sleep more delicate. You may also notice a second question appearing. Why did I wake up? This question activates analysis. Analysis brings structure to thinking. Structure keeps thoughts organized, and organized thinking is not compatible with sleep. Sleep requires the opposite. Thoughts must loosen. They must lose direction. They must stop trying to resolve questions. But when the brain begins analyzing the situation, the mind becomes active again. There is also a subtle shift in emotional tone that happens during early morning awakenings. At this hour, the mind is more sensitive. Fatigue lowers emotional resilience. When resilience lowers, concerns can feel slightly heavier than they would during the day. A thought that would normally pass quickly may linger longer, not because the thought itself is stronger, but because the brain has fewer resources to dismiss it. Without dismissal, attention remains engaged, and attention keeps the brain closer to wakefulness. Another layer involves expectation. If you have experienced difficulty falling back asleep before, your brain may remember that pattern. When you wake and notice the time, a prediction can form automatically. This might be one of those nights again. Even a subtle prediction can influence physiology. Muscles may tense slightly. Breathing may become more deliberate. Heart rate may rise just enough to stabilize awareness. These changes are small, but in the fragile state between sleep and wakefulness, small changes matter. The wake-up itself may last only a few seconds, but monitoring, analysis, and expectation can quietly extend it. And the longer awareness remains stable, the harder it becomes for sleep to return naturally. After a few minutes of wakefulness, the brain often begins to settle again on its own. The initial alertness that follows an unexpected awakening rarely lasts forever. Your nervous system is designed to return to balance. Even if awareness remains present for a while, the body is still carrying the biological pressure for sleep. That pressure builds slowly across the night. It does not disappear simply because you woke up briefly. If attention begins to soften, the brain gradually releases its grip on structured thinking. Thoughts may still appear, but they begin to lose their sharp edges. Instead of forming clear questions or plans, they start to feel less organized, less directed. This is often the first sign that sleep is trying to return. The mind begins to loosen its structure. Ideas become shorter, less connected, less meaningful. You may notice small gaps between thoughts, moments where nothing in particular appears. These gaps are important. They are the spaces where sleep slowly re-enters. During these moments, the brain is no longer trying to solve anything. It is simply allowing awareness to fade again. The environment also supports this process. The darkness remains steady. The room stays quiet. There is no urgency, no demand for action. Nothing in the outside world requires attention. As the mind begins to recognize this, monitoring becomes less necessary. The brain slowly stops checking for problems. It stops searching for explanations. Instead, it begins returning to the passive state that allows sleep to continue. And once that passive state becomes stable again, sleep often follows naturally. Not suddenly, but gradually, the way it arrived earlier in the night. As the minutes pass, wakefulness often begins to feel less sharp. The mind may still notice the quiet around you, but the sense of urgency starts to fade. Thoughts become slower, less organized. They may appear briefly and then disappear without needing attention. This is a natural shift. The brain cannot maintain focused awareness forever while the body remains in a resting state. Eventually, attention begins to loosen. You may notice that the room feels calm again. The darkness no longer feels intense. It simply becomes the background. Breathing settles into its own quiet rhythm. The body remains still, supported by the surface beneath you. Nothing needs to change. Nothing needs to be solved. The mind does not need to understand why the awakening happened. It does not need to calculate the remaining hours of the night. Those questions slowly lose their importance. Instead, awareness begins to drift. Thoughts may appear like distant fragments, not complete ideas, just small impressions, a memory without detail, a sentence that fades before it finishes. These fragments are a sign that the brain is moving away from structured thinking. Structure dissolves, meaning softens, and as meaning softens, attention becomes lighter. With lighter attention, wakefulness becomes less stable. And when wakefulness becomes unstable, sleep can return quietly, often without you noticing the exact moment it happens. At this point in the night, there is nothing you need to do. The mind may still notice small thoughts, but they no longer need to be followed. They can simply appear and pass. The room remains quiet. The darkness remains steady. Nothing in the environment is asking for attention. Your breathing continues at its own gentle rhythm, slow, unforced. The body remains supported by the surface beneath you. There is no effort required. Awareness can simply rest. Sometimes the mind drifts between small moments of thinking and small moments of silence. A thought appears, then fades. A memory begins, then dissolves before it finishes. These small gaps between thoughts often become longer as the mind relaxes. The brain naturally moves away from structured thinking. It no longer tries to organize ideas or solve questions. Instead, awareness becomes softer, more open, less focused. Even if wakefulness is still present, it may begin to feel lighter, less defined, like the edge of a dream slowly forming. In this quiet state, the brain is already moving closer to sleep again. And sleep rarely arrives through effort. It returns when effort disappears. The night is still. Nothing around you is moving. The room remains quiet and steady. Your breathing continues softly, slow, natural, unforced. The body stays heavy and relaxed, supported by the surface beneath you. There is nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to prepare, nothing that requires attention. Thoughts may appear briefly, but they no longer need to continue. They can simply pass through awareness. Like distant echoes, the mind does not need to follow them. Silence slowly fills the space between thoughts. Those quiet spaces often grow longer with time. Attention becomes softer, less focused, more open. Awareness may drift, and drifting is enough. Sleep does not require effort. It only requires stillness, and stillness is already present. The night continues quietly around you. Nothing needs to change. Nothing needs to be solved. Your breathing moves slowly and naturally. The body remains still, supported, comfortable. The mind no longer needs to search for explanations. The awakening has already passed, and the night is still here. Thoughts may come and go softly, but they no longer need to be followed. They can simply fade. Awareness becomes lighter, more distant, more relaxed. The quiet of the room remains steady. The darkness remains calm. There is no urgency in this moment, only stillness, only rest. And as attention slowly loosens, the mind naturally returns to the rhythm of sleep.